Our ability to consciously process spoken Mandarin is limited. The only way forward is to listen so much that processing becomes automated. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to continue our series about listening comprehension in Chinese. So the idea here is to go beyond tīng dǒng. So we're not just happy noting that we don't understand something, we want to know why, and by extension also what we can do about it. This is episode 4 in this series, so I strongly suggest that you listen to the previous 3 episodes before you listen to this one. You can find links to all episodes in this series by going to the link in the description, and that includes episodes that haven't been published when I record this. So if you listen in the future and you want the full series, go to the link in the description and you will see which episode contains what part of the series. If you want to listen to the first episode, that was in episode 111, where I kind of summarized the whole series and talked about listening comprehension in general. Then in part 2, which was episode 112 in the podcast, we talked about bottom-up processing, so extracting information from the sounds that we hear. And then in part 3, which was episode 121 on the podcast, we talked about top-down processing, which is about using what you already know and understand and expect to interpret and make sense of what you listen to. In order to understand spoken Chinese, we do of course need to do both these things. We need to be able to extract information from what we hear, but we also need to be able to interpret that and use what we already know to make this processing easier. And these two processes are always ongoing and support each other. In this episode, we're going to talk about listening comprehension from a slightly different angle, and we're going to focus on what's called automated and controlled processing. And to put this very briefly, automated processing deals with many things in parallel, but it's not something that we do consciously. Controlled processing, on the other hand, is conscious, and we need to focus our attention for it to work, and because of this, it can only focus on one thing at a time. The goal for us language learners is to automate as much as possible, while also making sure that we make the best use possible of controlled processing to deal with the rest, i.e. the parts we can't process in an automated fashion. One way of understanding these two types of processing is to say that our conscious effort to understand spoken language, controlled processing, is like using a spotlight to make sense of a rapid chase through a dense jungle at night. So no matter how quickly we move the spotlight around, we can only look at one thing at a time, and the scenery changes so quickly that we will never get a good idea of the bigger picture. Fortunately, we don't need to consciously process everything we hear. With experience and exposure to the language, we gain the ability to automatically process spoken language. This is more like a floodlight, albeit rather a weak one to begin with at least. Its light is not as bright, but in contrast to the spotlight, it isn't directional and can illuminate more things than once, and thus give us a better idea of what the landscape itself looks like. Understanding spoken Chinese is both about making efficient use of the spotlight and, more importantly, improving the strength and capacity of the floodlight. This will not come as a surprise to anyone who has basic knowledge of cognitive psychology, but it is rather amazing how limited our consciousness and our attention are in comparison with what most people think. People who haven't studied cognitive psychology, that is. I said above that the spotlight can only focus on one thing at a time, and for some of you this might sound rather exaggerated. It did to me at least when I first heard about this. An example of this is that according to most models of speech perception, you can't focus on more than one conversation at once. To be more specific, you can't pay attention and process more than one thing at a time, which doesn't necessarily mean that you can follow the gist of 2 simultaneous but separate monologues. You could achieve this by switching attention between them very fast, which won't let you process everything said in both conversations, but if your top-down listening is up to par, you can still fill in the missing pieces, and see the previous part in this series for more about this. This is very hard though, even in one's native language. After reading about this years ago, I have tried to pay attention to 2 conversations at once many times, but the more I try, the more convinced I become that it's not possible. The same goes for focusing on 2 separate aspects in a single conversation, although it's still of course possible to rapidly switch between different things and focus on them one at a time. Switching focus isn't always a good thing though. An example of this is the cocktail party effect, which refers to the phenomenon of reacting to stimuli in an otherwise ignored channel, such as hearing one's name in a different conversation from the one you're in at a cocktail party. This has been linked to low working memory capacity, so if your working memory has low capacity, you're more likely to get distracted, as it were, by hearing your name in a different conversation, even though that's not what you're focusing on. The ability to focus one's attention without distraction has positive effects on listening comprehension in general. So, focusing on the right things is as important as being able to ignore irrelevant things. Let's look at a few examples from learning Mandarin that most of you should be able to identify with. So the first one is learning to hear tones in Mandarin. And most beginners struggle with tones. Some might be able to hear the difference between a high flat tone, the first tone, and a low falling tone, the third tone, but it's common to not hear the difference between, say, a rising tone and a falling tone because they are both changing in a similar way. However, as you keep listening and paying attention, you will learn what distinguishes these tones from each other. And at first, this will be effortful and it will require your utmost attention. But when you've studied for a while, you'll be able to stop thinking about tones all the time. This frees up a lot of controlled processing capacity that can now be used for other things. I've written more about this in an article called Learning How to Hear the Sounds and Tones in Mandarin, and as usual, I'll put a link in the description. So the next example is figuring out where one word ends and the next begins. Spoken language doesn't really have any pauses in it normally, it's just an onslaught of different sounds linked together, and the reason we perceive it as words is because we're used to listening to this language. So when we listen to a foreign language, it often sounds like an uninterrupted stream of gibberish. It's not just that we don't understand the words, it's that we don't even know how to separate longer utterances into words, i.e. segmentation. This is because different languages do this differently, like I said, and it's also common for words to be pronounced differently in different contexts, which makes the boundaries between words even less clear. And tone change in Mandarin is a good example of this. Chinese is a bit peculiar in that this segmentation issue is also present in the written language, because we use no spaces between words. But this is of course also a problem when learning the spoken language. It's just that in Chinese it's also reflected in writing. However, this becomes much less of a problem over time, and while you might still struggle recalling the meaning of words, or with interpreting them as an intermediate learner, you will no longer find it hard to cut sentences up into words at least. As you learn more about Mandarin syllable structure, for example, you will know that a syllable can't end with a P, and that reduced syllables with neutral tones never appear in the first syllable of a word, and so on. And so the third example is understanding complex sentences. When you first start learning Chinese, word order seems very straightforward because it's the same as in English, right? It's SVO or subject verb object, or to name an example, 我爱你, so I love you. Same order as in English, very easy. Soon, however, you realize that this is not that easy actually, because even simple phrases like the person I love is completely different in English and in Chinese. In Chinese, it's 我爱的人, which obviously uses a completely different word order. This takes a while getting used to, and as a beginner and lower intermediate learner, you need to consciously find the de to untangle the sentence sometimes, and this is especially true if the part before the de is quite long. But as you learn more, you will no longer struggle with sentences like this, because the process has become automated. So to summarize, the problem is that while you can focus on something specific and facilitate processing in that area, something we will discuss later in this series when we get to listening strategies, you can't do this with everything all at once. You can't focus your attention on tones while you also focus on word segmentation, while you also try to figure out the grammatical structure of a sentence. This is why listening is so effortful in the beginning and why it often fails. This is also why listening many times yields better and better results, even if no extra clues or extra information is needed. The only solution is to practice enough that these processes become more and more automated. So the problem then is that as second language learners, our cognitive resources often can't cope with the demands put on them when listening to spoken Mandarin. These demands aren't limited to listening itself either, because if you want to do something with what you hear, such as formulating your own response to a question somebody asks you, you also need processing capacity to interpret what they say, what you want to say in response, and how to phrase this in Chinese. For a conversation to flow naturally, you need to do all this while listening. This is clearly not possible if you need all the attention you can muster just to understand what's being said. The way forward, like I said, is automation. You need to be so familiar with the spoken language that you can process sounds and tones instantly, recall words without delay, and put them all together without needing to think about it. Naturally, this won't happen overnight, but there is a simple way to learn this. Listen more. And I did say simple rather than easy solution, because of course, even if taking a single step is easy, walking 1,000 miles isn't. There are numerous articles and podcast episodes already about listening more, and here are the 3 most popular ones, and again I'll put links to these in the description. So the first one I recommend is 3 steps to more and better Chinese listening practice. The second one is how to find more time practicing Chinese listening. And the third one is 7 ideas for smooth and effortless Chinese listening practice. So when I say that you're supposed to listen more, what I mean here is making sense of spoken Chinese. And that means that you need to understand what you're listening to, otherwise it's too hard and you should find something else to listen to. Ideally, your listening should fulfill the requirements for meaning-focused input, which is the first of Paul Nation's 4 strands. So not learning new words, grammar, and so on. It should be trying to make sense of Chinese where you already know most of the words and grammar required. For more about Nation's 4 strands, you can tune into episode 94 of the podcast where we talked about that. So even if the goal of listening here isn't mainly to learn new words and grammar, you will of course learn lots of vocabulary and so on if you listen more. But this will happen naturally only if the unknown language content is at a manageable level. And that usually means something like below 5% and ideally closer to 1 or 2%. Naturally, you can also balance this a little bit if you study and if you actively go in and learn the words, you can manage with a higher level of unknown words. But if you want to learn incidentally, i.e. simply by listening, you need to understand almost everything except for those words that you're acquiring. In my experience, students spend too much time learning new things and nowhere near enough consolidating what they've already learned. And I wrote more about this in an article called How to Become Fluent in Chinese, which is episode 99 in the podcast. So the conclusion here is that you should listen more, and probably a lot more. Most students I talk to spend most of their time doing other things, learning vocabulary, reading, studying grammar, and so on, but they are not listening nearly as much as they should. Those of you who don't listen much outside class and your textbook audio once in a while should rethink the way you are learning and find ways to include at least as much listening as all other forms of learning combined. I know this sounds a bit extreme, but it's actually not that difficult if you take the advice that I offer in the articles I linked to earlier. And to say something very briefly about it here, I'm not saying that you should sit down and just listen to Chinese as much as you do all other studying. I'm saying that you should make sure that you're listening to Chinese while doing other things, and that way you can actually listen quite a lot, and it's not difficult to get up to 10-20 hours a week with some practice. Another thing I want to say here is that you really can't listen too much. While you might regret that you spent 100 hours on learning characters, grammar, or something like that later, you will never really regret spending 100 hours on listening, because it will have such positive effects on your Chinese in general, not just listening. Naturally, the results of listening will not show immediately. It will take time for your brain to absorb enough information and to automate the processes we have been talking about here. So give it at least a month or 2 before you decide if it's for you or not. If you've reached the intermediate plateau or even beyond that as an advanced learner, you should expect to spend much more time than that before you see any noticeable progress, of course. Now that we have covered the basic aspects of listening ability in Chinese in these 4 episodes, we're going to turn to factors that influence listening comprehension, namely who's listening, so that's factors related to you as a listener, what type of listening it is, so situational factors, and finally, what language we're talking about, so language factors specific to Chinese here. So stay tuned for the next installment in this series. And as usual, I know that I'm very interested in listening comprehension, but there are more aspects of learning Chinese than that. So we will talk about different things on the podcast for a while before we return to this episode and continue discussing listening comprehension in Mandarin. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.